Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting into one of those slightly uncomfortable corners of history. The one that's filled with pitchforks, pointy hats, and women who apparently just couldn't catch a break. So dim the lights, settle in, and get comfortable, because tonight we're going to take a long, sleepy stroll through the world of witches. Not the wand-waving, broom-flying movie ones, the real kind, or at least the women who got accused of being them. Spoiler, most of them weren't exactly tossing fireballs in the village square. They were more likely just being poor, inconvenient, or widowed. Now, here's the thing about witches in history. They were almost always women who didn't quite fit into the neat little box that society wanted them to sit in. And by society, I mostly mean the local men who thought a crabby old widow was somehow a threat to their cow's milk supply. Because, as you'll see, the bar for becoming a witch was painfully low. Like, trip over it in the dark and suddenly you're a servant of Satan low. Let's start gently in medieval Europe, around the late Middle Ages, when things really started cooking. Before that, in earlier centuries, witchcraft wasn't seen as this massive, demonic conspiracy. The church, surprisingly, didn't really care much about your neighbor muttering over herbs or leaving bread out for the fairies. At worst, it was frowned upon, maybe a little pagan holdover, but not the end of the world. Then, somewhere around the 14th century, everything escalated. Suddenly, the idea took hold that witches weren't just eccentric weirdos, they were actively teaming up with the devil himself. And that, apparently, was a capital offense. Why the shift? Well, Europe in the late Middle Ages wasn't exactly the most stable place. You had the Black Death wiping out a third of the population, famine sweeping through villages, constant wars, and a general vibe of, whew, God must be really mad at us. So, naturally, when crops failed or cattle keeled over, the simplest answer was, oh, Gertrude must have cursed us again. Because, obviously, blaming a 70-year-old widow with a crooked back was much easier than confronting the reality of, say, infectious disease or terrible farming practices. And yes, it was usually women. About 75 to 80% of all accused witches were female. Why? Well, women were already socially vulnerable, especially if they didn't have a husband or children to protect them. Widows, spinsters, or just the village difficult woman were prime candidates. If you think about it, witch trials were kind of society's way of saying, we don't know what to do with you, so let's just set you on fire. Very practical, very medieval. Let's float over to the stereotypes. The witch look wasn't just invented by Halloween marketing. Villagers genuinely believed certain women looked witchy. Who made the cut? Older women with wrinkled faces, women with warts or scars, women with disabilities. Basically, anyone whose appearance didn't scream fertile, obedient wife material. And if you were loud, or stubborn, or maybe had the audacity to speak your mind in a meeting, congratulations. You've just won yourself a starring role in the local witch hunt. Now, you'd think that if witches were supposed to be these powerful, terrifying servants of Satan, the trials would be filled with spooky tales of dark rituals. Sometimes, yes, but more often the accusations were painfully mundane. Like, my neighbor's bread didn't rise properly after I argued with her, must be witchcraft. Or, that old lady touched my cow and then the cow got sick, clearly demonic forces at work. Basically, if something inconvenient happened, the local women got blamed. It's the historical version of your Wi-Fi going out and deciding Mercury must be in retrograde. But here's where it gets more tragic. Once accused, it was almost impossible to prove your innocence. Trials often used tests that were, well, let's just say rigged from the start, like the famous swimming test. The idea was you'd tie the accused woman up and throw her in a river. If she floated, it meant the water was rejecting her because she was a witch. If she sank, then congrats, she was innocent. Except she also drowned,
So really, it was less of a test and more of a lose-lose situation with bonus hypothermia. And then there was the infamous witch's mark. Officials would strip search accused women looking for any unusual spots on their bodies, moles, scars, or even freckles. If they found something odd, they declared it a devil's teat, where demons came to suckle. Yes, that was a real belief. Imagine being dragged half-naked in front of a crowd and someone pointing at your birthmark like, "Aha! Evidence!" It's as ridiculous as it is horrifying. Now let's pause here. Were all witch accusations about unwanted women? Not entirely. Sometimes men got accused too, especially if they were poor or outsiders. But the overwhelming majority were women who, in one way or another, weren't fitting the mold. You were too poor, too outspoken, too old, or too independent. Or maybe you were just unlucky enough to have cranky neighbors. Basically, society's spare puzzle pieces got shoved into the witchcraft box. Take the case of the German witch hunts in the late 1500s. Entire villages saw waves of accusations, often fueled by local politics or vendettas. One particularly grim detail: sometimes children accused their mothers. Imagine the pressure a kid felt if the village preacher was glaring at them, asking, "Did your mom ever act suspicious?" Say yes, and your mom gets hauled off. Say no, and maybe they think you're bewitched too. It's a lose-lose dynamic that ruined families for generations. And let's not forget the economic side. If a widow owned a small plot of land, accusing her of witchcraft was a convenient way for neighbors or relatives to snatch it. Witchcraft trials were often less about demons and more about power, greed, and cleaning up undesirable women from the social landscape. The devil may have been the excuse, but human pettiness did most of the work. By the time we reached the early modern period, things had escalated into mass panics. Think Salem, though Europe had its own much bloodier version centuries earlier. But the underlying theme stayed the same. Women who didn't fit in, didn't behave, or just got unlucky became scapegoats. The witch label was less about actual sorcery and more about control. Control of behavior, control of property, and control of women's roles. And while it's tempting to laugh at how absurd some of the accusations were, like blaming witches for beer going flat, it's also deeply sad. Because behind every trial was a woman whose real crime was just existing outside society's narrow expectations. All right, let's drift a little further. In Part 2, we'll move deeper into some of the individual stories, the real women who became famous or infamous witches. We'll meet a few who were healers, some who were midwives, and others who were just unlucky enough to have a sharp tongue in the wrong village. Spoiler, almost none of them were actually doing anything remotely satanic. But that didn't stop the bonfires. So take a breath, stretch out, and let's wander onward.
All right, so we floated through the general atmosphere of witch hunts. Cranky neighbors, flat beer, suspicious freckles, all that. Now let's zoom in a little closer and actually meet some of the women who became, in their time, the poster children for witchcraft accusations. Spoiler, you're not going to find many glamorous broom flyers here. Mostly it's just regular people who had the misfortune of living in the wrong village with the wrong enemies. Let's start with Alice Keitler. She's often called Ireland's first recorded witch, which sounds like an award you wouldn't really want. Alice was a wealthy innkeeper in the early 1300s, and she had the kind of life story that makes you think, oh, people were absolutely going to accuse her of something eventually. Why? Well, she married 4 times. 4. In medieval Ireland, that alone was eyebrow-raising. Each husband conveniently died, leaving her wealthier every time. Which, you can see how gossip started to bubble. By 1324, her stepchildren, because of course there were stepchildren, accused her of using sorcery to kill her husbands. And let's be honest, it's not hard to imagine jealous kids thinking, evil stepmother, dead fathers, lots of money, yeah, let's call it witchcraft. They accused her of everything, from making potions out of unsavory ingredients to having a demon lover named Robin, which honestly sounds less like demonic possession and more like medieval tabloid fodder. The trial dragged on, and while some of her servants were tortured into confessions, Alice herself did something rather un-witch-like. She fled. She actually escaped Ireland entirely, vanishing into history. Her maid, unfortunately, wasn't so lucky. She was whipped and burned at the stake. So Alice's story is one of the rare ones where the accused woman managed to slip away, though it probably didn't feel like a victory when her servant paid the price. Next, let's drift north to Scotland, where witch hunting was practically a national pastime in the late 1500s. Enter Agnes Sampson, one of the most famous accused witches from the North Berwick trials. Agnes was a midwife and healer, which was already enough to make you suspicious in the eyes of people who thought childbirth pain was God's punishment, and herbs were suspiciously effective. In 1590, a storm hit the sea voyage of King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England. James, being the deeply paranoid and not particularly rational man that he was, decided the storm must have been conjured by witches, because, obviously, weather couldn't just happen. Agnes was accused of leading a coven that supposedly met with the devil in person. Her interrogator shaved all the hair off her body, because they thought witches could hide magical charms in, well, literally anywhere. They also tortured her until she confessed to meeting Satan and even recited details about King James's private wedding night, which naturally convinced him she must be guilty. Agnes was strangled and burned in 1591. But her case is important because it shows how witchcraft accusations often tied directly into the fears of powerful men. James was terrified of plots against him, so Agnes and dozens of others got swept up in his paranoia. So much for being a humble village healer.
Now, if we float over to England, we find the Pendle witches. Their story, in 1612, reads like a tragic soap opera with a supernatural twist. Pendle, in Lancashire, was a poor region full of family rivalries and grudges. Two feuding families, the Demdikes and the Chaddocks, were both known for dabbling in folk magic. And by folk magic, I mean things like charms, blessings, and curses. The kind of everyday superstitions people actually believed in and sometimes paid for. When a local peddler had a stroke after a spat with one of the women, things snowballed. Before long, both families were pointing fingers at each other, and the authorities happily rounded up a dozen people. The trial was messy, fueled by testimony from, get this, a 9-year-old girl. Because nothing says solid evidence like a third grader pointing at grandma and declaring she's in league with the devil. 10 people were executed, and their story became one of the most famous witch trials in England. What's telling about Pendle is how ordinary poverty and feuds could turn into witchcraft cases. These weren't women sneaking off to dance with demons. They were families trying to scrape by, sometimes leaning into the reputation of having special powers because honestly, it brought in a little money. But once officials smelled fear and villagers smelled opportunity, accusations spiraled into executions. Let's drift across the Atlantic for a moment to the famous Salem witch trials in 1692. Now, Salem gets a lot of attention, but what's interesting when you compare it to European witch hunts is how late it happened. By the 1690s, Europe had mostly burned itself out on witch trials. But in Puritan Massachusetts, the witch panic hit its peak. The Salem accusations started with a group of young girls who began having fits and blamed local women for bewitching them. And let's be honest, teenage drama in a strict Puritan society was always going to explode somehow. The trial snowballed quickly, and over 200 people were accused. 19 were executed, and one man was pressed to death with stones because he refused to plead. What stands out in Salem is how social tensions played into the accusations. Salem Village was divided between wealthy families, struggling farmers, and quarrels about church leadership. Witchcraft accusations became a convenient weapon in these local rivalries. And, as usual, women on the margins, widows, poor women, or those with sharp tongues, were hit the hardest. Now, before you drift off too far, let's zoom out again. Across all these stories, Alice Keitler, Agnes Sampson, the Pendle women, the Salem victims, the pattern is pretty clear. Witches weren't so much about black magic as they were about being in the wrong place socially. Too independent? Suspicious. Too outspoken? Suspicious. Too poor? Definitely suspicious. And if you happen to outlive multiple husbands, you might as well start packing for the stake. Of course, not everyone who practiced folk healing or midwifery was accused. Plenty of women quietly went about their business without issue. But once accusations started flying, having any reputation for being different was dangerous. It was like medieval cancel culture, except instead of losing followers, you lost your head. What's maybe most haunting is how many women were accused by people they knew well. Family, neighbors, even friends. It wasn't strangers pointing the finger, it was the people closest to them, which shows just how deep the fear ran and how easily suspicion could turn deadly. And yet, despite the terror, witch beliefs persisted for centuries. Even after laws against witchcraft were repealed, the idea of the witchy woman lingered in folklore and culture. You could say it's the ultimate example of how unwanted women were turned into scapegoats and then mythologized. All right, take a slow breath. Stretch your shoulders. In Part 3, we'll drift even deeper into the psychology behind all this. Why did people keep seeing witches everywhere? What made society so eager to turn ordinary women into agents of the devil? We'll talk about fear, power, and why the word witch still carries a sting even today.
So we've met some of the unlucky women dragged into the spotlight of witch trials. Alice, Agnes, the Pendle crew, the poor villagers of Salem. Now let's step back and ask the big, sleepy question. Why on earth did people keep seeing witches everywhere? Because, spoiler, there weren't any. And yet, for hundreds of years, entire communities swore blind that the devil was hanging out in their barns and stealing their butter. To understand this, we need to glide into the medieval and early modern mindset. Life back then was hard. And I don't mean I forgot to charge my phone hard. I mean, you wake up, your only cow is dead, your bread is moldy, your neighbor has the plague, and it's raining for the 4th week straight. Hard. In a world like that, you needed explanations. Because humans hate randomness. We want neat little causes and effects. And if the crops failed, well, someone must have cursed them. If a child died suddenly, surely it wasn't just disease. It had to be evil forces. And who made the easiest targets? Women who were already a bit on the edges. If you were poor, cranky, or lived alone, congratulations, you were the human equivalent of a scapegoat. Basically, witchcraft was medieval society's customer support hotline. Hello, I'd like to report my problem. My sheep died. Whose fault is it? Answer? Probably that widow 2 houses down. Now, there's also the religious side. By the late Middle Ages, the church had really leaned into the idea of the devil as an active player in everyday life. Earlier, Christians thought of Satan as more of a distant cosmic enemy. But from around the 13th century, theologians started writing about how the devil was basically running around Europe recruiting foot soldiers. This is where witchcraft shifted from silly superstition to existential threat. Because if you thought witches were literally holding hands with Satan, then suddenly your weird neighbor wasn't just annoying, she was a danger to the entire community. And once the idea spread that witches were part of a vast, secret conspiracy, paranoia exploded. It wasn't just, Gertrude cursed my cow. It became, Gertrude is part of a midnight Sabbath where they kiss the devil's butt, murder babies, and ruin Christendom. Which honestly says more about the imaginations of inquisitors than about the women themselves. but it gave authorities the perfect excuse to crack down. Now let's drift into the psychological angle. Accusing someone of witchcraft was a way of externalizing fear. If you were anxious about your failing farm, blaming a witch gave you a sense of control. It's the same mental trick as blaming Mercury retrograde or a bad horoscope today. Only, with more bonfires. And then there's gender. Witch hunts weren't just about superstition. They were about enforcing roles. A woman who was too independent threatened the system. She wasn't under a husband's control. She wasn't producing heirs. She wasn't quietly making bread at home. So labeling her as a witch was a neat way to punish that independence. In a way, witch trials were society's method of filing complaints against women who didn't behave. Let's not forget envy. A woman with healing skills, or even just someone whose butter churned more successfully than her neighbors, could draw suspicion. It's a classic case of, why is her bread better than mine? Must be witchcraft. Imagine living in a village where every little success sparked conspiracy theories. It's like the original version of gossip Twitter, only with fewer memes and more nooses. Now, why did this paranoia stick around for so long? Part of it is that witch hunts were incredibly useful for people in power. Local leaders, priests, even monarchs could use them to show they were protecting society. Nothing rallies a nervous community like saying, "The devil is among us, but don't worry, I've got this covered." It gave them authority, justified harsh laws, and, conveniently, let them confiscate property from convicted witches, because yes, greed was always lurking behind the sermons. Fear also spread like wildfire because witch stories were just everywhere. Pamphlets, sermons, gossip. The 16th and 17th centuries were basically the golden age of witch propaganda. And when everyone you know is convinced witches are real, it's hard not to go along. Even if you personally thought it was nonsense, would you really risk saying so out loud? Probably not, unless you wanted to join the accused. It's also worth noting that not every region was equally obsessed. Some areas of Europe barely bothered with witch trials at all, while others went absolutely wild. Germany, for example, saw some of the most brutal panics, with thousands executed in the late 1500s and early 1600s. Meanwhile, places like Spain and Italy, ironically, weren't nearly as enthusiastic, despite having the dreaded Inquisition. Turns out, the Inquisition was often more skeptical of wild accusations than local village courts. So, oddly enough, you might have been safer from witch hunts in Spain than in some small German town. History is full of these weird ironies. Now, here's another sleepy thought. The image of witches also reflected deeper anxieties about women's bodies. Midwives, healers, and women involved in childbirth were often accused because childbirth was both terrifying and mysterious to men who had no clue what was going on. If something went wrong, it was easier to blame the midwife than admit that medieval medicine was basically useless. In that way, witch hunts were partly about controlling knowledge, silencing women who had practical healing skills that challenged male-dominated medicine. And then there's the sexual paranoia. Witch trial records are full of bizarre obsessions with witches supposedly having sex with demons, flying naked through the night, or attending grotesque sabbaths. It's hard not to notice how much of this reads like the fever dreams of repressed priests rather than anything women were actually doing. But it served a purpose. It painted accused women as not just dangerous, but also morally corrupt, which made it easier to justify punishing them.
So when we ask, were witches just unwanted women? The answer is largely yes, but with a footnote. They were also the projection screens for all society's fears about hunger, disease, sex, death, and power. If something scared people and they couldn't explain it, they pinned it on witches. And since most accused witches were women outside the norm, the label stuck. Eventually, of course, the witch hunts died down. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the Enlightenment started shifting the conversation. Educated elites began rolling their eyes at the idea of witches flying around on goats. Trials slowed, laws softened, and soon accusing your neighbor of sorcery made you look a bit silly rather than righteous. But the damage had already been done. Tens of thousands of people, mostly women, had been executed for crimes that didn't exist. And yet, the stereotype lingers. Even today, the word witch still gets used as shorthand for difficult, independent, or dangerous women. The Halloween caricature with the pointed hat and cackle, that's the cultural afterlife of centuries of real persecution. It's history's way of turning tragedy into kitsch. All right, take another deep breath. In Part 4, we'll drift into the personal side again, the small, human details of accused witches' lives. What did they eat? How did they survive? And what went through their minds as neighbors turned against them? Because sometimes the most haunting part isn't the trials themselves, but the everyday loneliness of being the village outcast.
So far, we've floated around the big picture. Trials, paranoia, kings who thought storms were personal attacks. But let's slow it down now. Imagine being one of these so-called witches, not in the courtroom, not at the stake, but on an ordinary Tuesday. Because that's where most of their lives happened, in the dull rhythm of chores, gossip, and survival. If you were an older widow in a small village, your daily life might look something like this. Wake up in a cold, drafty cottage, no husband, maybe no children left at home. You're probably living on the margins, a tiny patch of land, maybe a cow or two if you're lucky. Your meals? Mostly bread, pottage, and whatever you can scrape together. Honestly, being a witch didn't come with perks. No bubbling cauldrons of endless stew, just watery broth with turnips. Now, if you knew a little about herbs, say you could make a poultice for aching joints or a tea for stomach cramps, congratulations, you've just become suspicious. Healing knowledge was double-edged. Villagers wanted your remedies, but if they didn't work, or worse, if the patient died anyway, suddenly your harmless herb garden became a sign of devilish activity. And then there's the social side. Villages ran on gossip. People noticed everything. Who didn't show up at church, whose cow gave sour milk, who scowled at whom at the marketplace. If you were the cranky neighbor, maybe you muttered when people annoyed you or you argued over firewood rights, that stuck. Later, when bad luck hit, your little outburst became part of the case file in the collective village brain. Remember when she cursed under her breath? That explains why my chickens died. One of the saddest parts is how loneliness itself became evidence. Widows and spinsters were already viewed as incomplete. No husband, no children, no role that made sense in the community's framework. So your isolation made people nervous. Why did you live alone? Why didn't you remarry? Who were you talking to in that empty cottage? Maybe spirits? Demons? Your cat? Ah, yes, the cat. The humble household pet was a big problem. Cats, especially black ones, were seen as familiars, animal companions given to witches by the devil. So if you had a furry friend for company, villagers might whisper that you weren't just feeding scraps, you were feeding spirits. A lonely woman with a pet became an instant target. In other words, medieval society basically invented the crazy cat lady stereotype centuries before the internet did. Even begging could turn dangerous. Poor women often relied on charity from neighbors. If someone refused you food and then misfortune struck their house, they might decide your sharp look or grumbled thanks was a curse. Imagine being hungry, asking for bread, being turned away, and then blamed for a sick cow a week later. You can't win. Let's not forget church life. Religion was the center of community, and not showing up could get noticed fast. But what if you were too ill to walk there? What if you skipped a service because of work or exhaustion? Congratulations again. You now looked like you were avoiding holy spaces. Even small absences got folded into suspicion. And children, oh, the children. Kids repeated everything. If you scolded them for stealing apples from your garden, they might run home crying, "The old woman cursed me." From there, it didn't take much for parents to connect every future bruise or fever to your supposed witchcraft. One cranky afternoon, and suddenly your name was in the rumor mill. So daily life as an accused witch was essentially walking a tightrope over quicksand. Do too much for others, you're meddling. Do too little, you're cold and suspicious. Live alone, you're unnatural. Live loudly, you're dangerous. The safest role for women was obedient, quiet, and married. Anything else, and you were standing one bad harvest away from being accused. Now, let's slip into what daily fear might have felt like once the whispers started. Because once suspicion settled on you, every knock at the door carried tension. Was it a neighbor? A priest? The local constable with questions? You might live for months or years under a low hum of dread, waiting for the day someone finally dragged you to court. And what about the small comforts? These women weren't witches, but they did what anyone would do in bleak conditions, cling to little rituals, maybe whispering prayers at night, humming to themselves while working, or talking aloud to their animals for company. All normal behaviors, until someone else decided they looked suspicious. One of the cruelest details is how ordinary women's survival skills became rebranded as sorcery. Saving seeds, knowing planting cycles, predicting weather from clouds, all things experienced women did naturally could look like unnatural knowledge to outsiders. So the very skills that kept you alive marked you out for danger. And then there's the waiting. Trials didn't come instantly. Accusations could hang over you for weeks, months, even years. The anxiety must have been exhausting. Living in a small hut, trying to bake bread, wondering if every cough or glare from a neighbor would be the thing that tipped them into testifying against you. It wasn't a life of broomsticks and magic. It was a life of endless, grinding tension. So, when we picture witches as outsiders, we need to remember most of them were just women trying to survive, clinging to scraps of food, reputation, and dignity. Their lives were less about midnight Sabbaths and more about hoping their goat wouldn't die and that their neighbors would stop glaring. It's the tragedy of ordinary life turned into a crime. All right, take another slow breath. In Part 5, we'll float into the machinery of witch hunts themselves, how accusations turned into interrogations, the grim legal process, and why justice was usually just a polite word for torture. Not too dramatic, don't worry, just steady, slow, and quietly grim.
So far, we've wandered through the gossip, the loneliness, the cranky neighbors, and the unlucky pets. But how exactly did whispers in a village transform into public trials and executions? Tonight, let's drift through the slow, clunky, and frankly depressing machinery of witch hunts. Because spoiler, it wasn't justice, it was theater, and not the fun kind with costumes and music. The process usually started with an accusation, and as we've seen, the bar for that was low. A dead cow, a sick child, or just someone muttering in the wrong tone. Once suspicion took root, it could be formalized in court.
Medieval and early modern courts weren't exactly CSI. There were no fingerprints, no DNA swabs, no dramatic lab reveals. What they had was gossip, testimony, and a lot of confirmation bias. Step 1. Collect rumors. Neighbors would be called in to share their evidence. Evidence being, well, she looked at me funny once and then I stubbed my toe. In many places, the collective memory of the village became the case file. If enough people said you were suspicious, the court nodded along. It was less burden of proof and more burden of popularity. If you weren't liked, you were doomed. Next came the search for marks. Officials would often strip search the accused to look for witches' marks, strange moles, scars, or birthmarks. Basically, anything the body naturally produces. Entire squads of witch prickers existed. Yes, that was an actual job title. These cheerful professionals carried little needles and poked women all over, declaring any numb spot to be proof of diabolic activity. Imagine your local government hiring guys whose job was literally stabbing widows with pins. Medieval HR must have had an interesting hiring process. Then came the tests. You've probably heard of the swimming test. Tie up the accused, toss her in the water, and watch. Float? Guilty. Sink? Innocent and dead. It's hard to imagine a more lose-lose scenario. Then there was the prayer test. Suspected witches were told to recite the Lord's Prayer without error. If they stumbled or mispronounced a word, clearly Satan was in control of their tongue. Never mind that nerves, hunger, or not being able to read could explain mistakes. The system was built so you could only fail. And of course, the torture. Because why rely on weak gossip when you could get a confession? In many areas, torture was the standard path to truth. Methods varied. The strappado involved tying the victim's hands behind their back and hoisting them up by a rope, then dropping them suddenly. The rack stretched limbs until joints popped. Even simple sleep deprivation was common, keeping someone awake for days until their brain turned to mush. At that point, most people confessed to whatever the interrogators wanted. If they asked, "Did you dance with the devil on Tuesday?" the accused would say yes just to make the pain stop.
And here's the kicker. Once you confessed, it wasn't over. You were then expected to name accomplices, which meant your neighbors, friends, or even your children got dragged into the nightmare. Witch hunts spread like mold, because every confession sprouted more names, more trials, more panic. It was a self-feeding loop of paranoia. Now let's talk about the trial itself. These weren't grand affairs with lawyers and cross-examinations. Often they were quick hearings with local magistrates or church officials. Witnesses testified, the accused tried to defend themselves, and the verdict was almost always guilty. Juries and judges had no interest in acquittals. Better to execute 10 innocent women than risk letting one real witch slip away. The sentences varied by region. In England, witches were usually hanged. On the continent, burning at the stake was common, especially in Germany and Switzerland. Sometimes the accused were strangled before burning, a small mercy, sometimes not. Either way, executions were public. Entire communities turned out to watch. Children, neighbors, priests, merchants, all standing around the flames or the gallows as though it were a grim festival. For villagers, these executions were warnings and entertainment rolled into one. And of course, property was often seized. Families of accused witches lost land, goods, even homes, which meant, conveniently, that accusations had financial benefits for the accusers. If your neighbor's field looked tempting, a few whispered words about witchcraft could solve the problem. It was persecution wrapped in greed. What's eerie is how standardized the process became. By the late 1500s, entire manuals existed on how to identify witches. The most infamous was the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer. This delightful handbook explained how witches supposedly consorted with demons, how to interrogate them, and why women in particular were the devil's favorite recruits. It was basically a bestseller of misogyny. Courts across Europe leaned on it as justification. Reading it today is equal parts absurd and chilling. The arguments are flimsy, but people believed them with deadly seriousness. So let's pause for a sleepy reflection. Once the machinery kicked in, the accused had almost no chance. From the first whisper to the final noose, everything was stacked against them. The gossip fed the searches fed the torture fed the confessions fed the trials, and the trials fed the bonfires. It was less about finding truth and more about sustaining a cycle of fear. And yet, villagers went along with it. Some truly believed they were fighting Satan. Others simply didn't want to be next. Because here's the dark irony. The safest way to protect yourself from witchcraft accusations was often to accuse someone else first. Call it preemptive scapegoating, a grim little survival strategy in societies where paranoia was the air everyone breathed. So were witches just unwanted women? In the machinery of trials, yes. They were the spare parts fed into a grinding system that needed victims to keep turning. The trials weren't about magic. They were about control, conformity, and fear weaponized into law. All right, take a slow breath. In Part 6, we'll drift toward the decline, how societies eventually got tired of witch hunts, why the panic faded, and how the idea of witches transformed into folklore and Halloween costumes. Less torture, more irony.
So far, we've wandered through the whispers, the trials, the needles, and the flames. Now it's time to ask, why did it all eventually stop? Why did Europe, after centuries of paranoia, finally decide that maybe hanging your neighbor for muttering about milk wasn't the best judicial strategy? The decline of witch hunts didn't happen overnight. It was a slow leak, like air seeping from a badly patched balloon. A mixture of skepticism, exhaustion, and changing politics gradually deflated the craze. Let's start with the obvious problem: money. Witch hunts were expensive. Think about it. You had to pay the judges, the scribes, the witch prickers, the guards, the wood for the bonfire, even the rope. And then there were the travel costs for inquisitors who roamed around like supernatural accountants. In small towns, this drained local treasuries. Imagine blowing half your yearly budget on convicting a widow with 3 goats. Eventually, communities started realizing that maybe, just maybe, witch hunts were financially unsustainable. Then came the intellectual pushback. By the 1600s, the scientific revolution was tiptoeing onto the stage. People like Galileo, Bacon, and Descartes were busy with telescopes and logic, and while they weren't focused on witchcraft, their methods rubbed off. A few brave thinkers began asking awkward questions. If witches really fly at night, why don't we see them crashing into trees? Or, why does every confession sound exactly like the one extracted under torture yesterday? These were tiny cracks in the wall of certainty, but cracks spread. Some judges started resisting too. There are recorded cases of magistrates rolling their eyes at accusations and refusing to prosecute. A famous example: in 1631, a Jesuit priest named Friedrich Spee published Cautio Criminalis, basically a takedown of witch trials. He'd served as a confessor to many accused women, and he noticed something rather obvious. Every single one confessed under torture,
and nearly all recanted later. His conclusion: the trials were nonsense. It was one of the earliest calls to end the madness, and while it didn't stop witch hunts instantly, it planted seeds. The Protestant and Catholic divide also played a role. Both sides had eagerly accused the other of being in league with Satan, but eventually, religious authorities got tired of competing bonfires. Plus, as wars raged across Europe, the 30 Years' War being a standout disaster, energy shifted. Why spend time on neighborhood witches when entire armies were burning villages? Priorities changed.